So, welcome to the latest episode of MQ's Open Mind podcast. Craig and I are particularly excited today. We've got another brilliant guest. This time we've got the author of Vincent Deary, Professor Vincent Deary, author of How We Break. And I'm really keen to discuss that with you, Vincent, in a second. But before we do, a quick hello and quick thank you, anyway, for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. It's an honour. Really pleased to be here.
Yeah, it'd be great because obviously what we'll hopefully do, take our listener and viewer on a journey of a bit of your career. And I'll say
Okay.
I'm familiar with your work, but some others may not be. So tell us a bit about we start a bit about your history, maybe link it into mental health, and then obviously a bit about the books and sort of what you see as the sort of priorities for research in the area that you work in.
Yeah.
And this is a research podcast. So maybe first off, Vincent, let's rewind to where it all began. So give us a wee bit of a sort of pot of history in terms of how you've got to where you are now as Professor of Applied Health Psychology at Northumbria University in Newcastle.
It seems like a really random journey. There was never any intent, certainly to be in academia. Oh, where do you start the journey? That could be a whole podcast in itself, couldn't it? But
Well, and you do have, and the book does cover some of that journey as well.
it kind of does, yeah,
Yeah.
because I grew up with a lot of awareness of mental health because there was mental health issues in my family, not in a really full-on way. It was a very loving family, but my mum was very troubled by anxiety and depression, and that was never. She wasn't someone who would hide that. Let's say it was very present, and so I think we all learned to deal with stuff. And I think it's no accident that my brother's a professor of psychology, my sister's a community nurse. You know, we all apart from my other brother Stevie, who I think just wanted to get away from all of that, we all ended up in some kind of care profession. And ever since I was earning money for myself, that's what I've done to make money. You know, and it's been in the caring profession. And I did start off in medicine. Actually, I got into medical school at Edinburgh University, and I was just not temperamentally suited to it at all. And in those days, I don't know if you still can, you could do an intercalated degree. So you took a year out to go into the honours year of the subject that you particularly excelled in. And I did an intercalated honours in psychology, and I was like,
Ah,
this is where I belong. But then I dropped out, and that's a whole other kind of life story. But when I kind of got back into not being a bohemian, I decided to train as a psychiatric nurse at the Maudsley Hospital, and that's really where the kind of the journey that took me to here
mhm.
sort of seriously begins with psychiatric nurse training.
We'll just pause you there for a second. Let's rewind a wee bit in terms
Yeah,
of you're not in Newcastle now, but obviously you're a Scot, Carluke.
yeah, yeah. Well done. Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, Carluke's a place I don't think many people outside of Scotland may know. Maybe I'm being disrespectful to Carluke.
Well,
I
I was
don't
going to
know.
say many people outside of Carluke, to be honest, Rory. What are we famous for? Scott's Jam was famous for that, and there's a really good butcher, Ramsay's Butcher, where, like in my local posh department store in Newcastle, they sell Ramsay's black pudding,
Yeah, yeah,
which is
no, yeah.
incredibly good. So that's basically what we're
I
famous
didn't know
for.
So Ramsay's is in Carluke.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, I've
Yep.
learned something about Scotland today.
There you go. So no, Curlick, I mean, these days it's become, I was just up there at the weekend. It's what, see my sister who still lives there. It's what now called a dormitory town for Glasgow. So it's basically
Mhm.
full of commuters.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Whereas when I grew up, it was basically becoming an ex-mining town. So
Mhm.
all my dad's brothers were miners. He was a cobbler, but it was very working class town, which no aspersions in the working class. But growing up as a slightly odd queer kid, for want of a better way of putting it, I didn't exactly fit in to that environment very well. I had quite a difficult time of mid 1970s Scotland in Curluke.
Yeah, you
But
talk a bit about that in the second book, obviously,
yeah,
maybe break and I think did you talk about some bullying experiences?
yeah, the second book was a much more difficult write than the first book. And part of what made it an interesting challenge, but one that took a wee while to square, was fitting together the science, the sociology, the philosophy, and the personal in a way that kind of brought them all together, to each one to illuminate the other. And part of what I wanted to do in doing that was bring my own story and the story of people that I know and loved into, in a way, to say that you don't need to cross the clinical line to break. I didn't particularly cross the clinical line, but I certainly struggled. And one of the things that I saw in myself and in my mum is that when you're not a good fit for the environment that you're raised or have to try and survive in, you're given back to yourself as work. And that's one of the themes in the book, is when do things become work, and when do you become work for yourself? Because you have to, very early on, I had to learn what anxiety was, and how to manage it, and interpersonal difficulty and social stuff. A lot of stuff that, if you're a good fit, it doesn't really come up for you. And I've seen that in the clinic a lot, kind of jumping to adult life and working in the fatigue clinic. I was sometimes seeing people who had never come up against the limits of themselves before, or who had never encountered their own anxiety or depression. And looking back, in a way, maybe it makes it a little easier if you encounter it early on. But either way, you have to learn how to manage yourself. And that's part of what I'm writing about in the book.
Okay, we'll return to the book in a wee minute, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're now at the Maudsley, did you say, training?
Yeah.
And then, but obviously then my understanding or my memory is 2011 you went into academia. So
Yes.
what was it? So you did your time nursing, and then what brought you to the academic route?
So a brief shout out to the Maudsley psychiatric nurse training back in the day. I was a Maud 90, and we were one of the last cohort where there was just 10 of us in the year. And every week we did group dynamics based on Bion, one of the British psychoanalysts. And so you got this really intense schooling in interpersonal processes. And in those days, we were running those kind of groups on wards where people were experiencing acute psychosis, but they still held the structure of the groups. And they also, at the end of every shift, you would debrief, you would tune into how you were feeling, you would do your kind of getting into the shift work, you would do your goodbye work for the shift. You really learned how to structure stuff in difficult circumstances. So I just wanted to say that that is still at the core of what it meant for me to kind of work with other people who were having any kind of distress. And then there was a course, I think it's still around, I don't know if it's still the same title, it's called the ENB 650, which is where psychiatric nurses could train to be cognitive behavioral therapists.
Okay, right.
Basically.
Yeah.
So that was my transition into working as a CBT therapist. And I worked with Trudy Cholder at the chronic fatigue unit in London.
Well.
Yeah, that was my first placement. And as you know, with Trudy, she's an incredibly nurturing, successful, just a lovely energy and a lovely, intelligent person to be around. And she just encouraged all the staff to do research, to make their practice research based. And that's when I began the transition into academia. I did a master's while I was there, and then moved from London, moved up to Edinburgh, took a couple of years out of working to begin working on the book, and thought I'd better start earning some money again because I was running out of it. And I got an MRC fellowship, doctoral fellowship at Newcastle University, which is how I ended up here. And that was the kind of the key transition from clinical work into academia.
And then how did you end up doing, obviously, with fatigue? Of course, that's within the domain of health psychology. So was that just that natural progression then into health?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It was never really by intention or design, but I've seemed to have ended up working in physical health and persistent physical symptoms fairly consistently for the last 3 decades. So it's inadvertently become my specialism. And kind of looking back, I'm really glad. I think it's informed my thinking about mental health in lots of ways that have been really useful too. So yeah, my PhD was looking at people with functional dysphonia, so people who had voice loss that wasn't explainable by physiology or pathophysiology.
And then in the clinic you're working in now, then, so I think it's a morning a week. I think you're doing currently. So it's a trans-diagnostic clinic.
Fatigue clinic, yeah. Well, to be accurate, the clinic I was working in, because unfortunately it's closed. So I left last November when I turned 60, And then Julia Newton, who was a consultant, she retired as well, and they just didn't replace us. So it's kind of a shame though, because the patients really loved it. It was quite an unusual clinic because it was transdiagnostic. So whatever the cause of your fatigue, be it liver disease, autoimmune conditions, post-cancer fatigue. We saw quite a lot of people with post-cancer treatment fatigue. You could come and see us. You would see me, the health psychologist. You would see an OT, a physio, and Julia, the consultant. And what a lot of the patients said was it was one of the few healthcare encounters where they felt the whole of them was being dealt with. And not only that, but being dealt with over a long period of time. So we were sometimes seeing people for 3-4 years and keeping them in follow-up after that if they needed to check in. And it was that holisticness and continuity of care that people really valued, I think. So yeah, I miss that work.
Yeah, okay. Well, I didn't know that. So it's a shame for obviously the patients who were using that clinic. But obviously, I suppose a reflection, I assume, also on tightened resources. So not going to
Yeah, definitely.
maybe continue with a new establish a new clinic. Okay, so let's basically fast forward to the reason we're really keen to talk to you is obviously you've just published book 2 of a trilogy, and I'll put it up for those who are seeing it, is How We Break. And obviously, as I say, it's book 2 is part of the trilogy. So do you want to tell us a bit about, those of you who are unfamiliar with the first book, tell us, well, how, I mean, because the bit I remember hearing before I bought the first book was that you, and this may or may not be true, Vincent, but it could be one of those folklore, but I think it is true, which was you've been writing notes for years and years. I think you may talk about that on different bits of book. Then you did, and this idea, you didn't think anybody would want to read it type idea. And then am I right in believing then you then were subject of a bidding war?
Yeah.
So that's not folklore. That's true. So tell us about that.
Yeah, that was totally weird. So I don't know about you guys. I think I'm a lot older than both of you, but as you get older, your memory gets worse. And I'm just trying to piece the timeline together. But I know I left London in 2003 and took a couple of years out. Left London when I was 40, 2003, and I'd been writing notes and keeping notebooks for years, and I'd never quite found a structure that worked. So took some time out to look at everything I'd written and try and figure out a structure that worked for me. And I was saying to you just before we started, Rory, that for me, the beginning of writing is always structured. Once I get a structure, I kind of know what I'm doing. Once I can see the shape of it. And kind of randomly, but definitively, one of the things I did when I was in Edinburgh was I did a screenwriting course, and just to do something different and interesting.
Had you an interest in going down the screenwriting route, or?
Partly, and I just loved film, and I wanted to know more about the nuts and bolts of film and how they're put together. And
well, that's very clear. If you read either of your 2 books, the film references are everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And popular culture, because, I think we are creatures of story, and I think story helps bring stuff together for us. So, I was really intrigued by learning about the nuts and bolts of storytelling. And of course, it's the classic 3-act structure of Act 1, setup of the kind of the normal world. Act 2, that world gets disrupted, what we would call in the trade biographical disruption. Then all of Act 2, you're doing the work of adjustment till eventually you get to the end of Act 3, where you're establishing a new normal. And as soon as I got that structure, I kind of thought that's the structure of the book, because this was originally conceived of as one big book. It was first part of it, how we are, is the kind of the normal creature going through habitual daily life, mainly on automatic, because I think we do until stuff comes along that we have to adjust to. Then in that book, kind of show what does normal, as in not really difficult adjustment, look like in daily life, and then we get back to normal. So that was the arc of book 1. Then book 2 is when does a big disruption come in? So how we break, when do we get pushed to the point where we can no longer get back to normal? And this sounds like a really egotistical thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. I think I was one of the first people to popularize the phrase "the new normal." I used that quite a lot in the first book, but it was a funny sitcom that had come out just at that point as well. And then book 3, the one I'm working in now, is okay. How do we reestablish equilibrium? We've been in our habitual world; it's been disrupted. So book 3 is now how do we kind of live post disruption?
So had you written all of book 1 before the bidding or how did that come about?
What did I? Yeah, I'd sat down. How to put this? But because of the ridiculous things that happened to London property prices in the 90s, we had bought a house in 1990, sold it in 2003. I could afford to take some time out.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've heard other people say it, but when you're writing, there's nothing like having protected writing time. You must
Mm-hmm.
know that as an academic. It's
Well,
so
a lack of protected writing time, obviously.
totally. So the first book happened relatively easily, and I really enjoyed it. It was a really enjoyable process because I didn't have a lot else to do at that time. And then when I started my fellowship, I was kind of finishing editing it, and it kind of it seemed to work really well. So finished that, but I left it in a drawer. I just because I liked it, and I'd shown it to some of my friends, and they liked it, but I didn't quite know what to do with it. I knew I'd kind of got down what I wanted to get down in a voice that I liked.
But at that stage, you hadn't approached a publisher or an agent
No,
or anything,
no, I just no, I was writing it for me really, which is probably why it was easy because there was no sense of an audience, there was no
and no pressure.
self-consciousness.
Yeah,
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 totally. And then I had a friend, Sarah Holloway, who had been a senior commissioning editor at Granta, so she
yeah.
knew the publishing world. Interestingly, she's transitioned into being a clinical psychologist very late in life. She's had a
That's
in,
the other direction.
yeah, absolutely. So approached her. She read it and she said, "I think this is good." And she gave me a list of agents, and then picked my agent Patrick Walsh, who I remember downstairs in the kitchen here one night when he was calling me up and going, "They've just bid this, they've just bid that." And I was going, "What the hell?" Uh,
Wow.
it was that was very unexpected, and I don't think I've ever really got over it. In a weird way.
And then, but that stage, then you had decided, had you, that it was going to be the trilogy?
Yeah, yeah.
You had decided that yourself now.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because it worked as I'd made in fact, even kind of fractally, I wanted each chapter to be freestanding, so you could just
Mhm.
pick it up and read it as an essay, and I wanted each book to be freestanding. But yeah,
Okay.
it was sold as a trilogy, which it is a relatively rare thing to happen for a new
For,
author to be
like I said, for
commissioned.
first time author. Wow.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to Penguin, and I'm particularly grateful to them that the first book was an easy, fairly quick write. The second one was a torturous, long slog, but they stuck by me, which is,
Yeah.
yeah, to their
Yeah, that's
credit.
good. Well, then just moving on to that, because obviously the first book I think came out just before COVID, or it was certainly pre-COVID time.
Yeah, pre-COVID, yeah.
And then obviously, I think you mentioned this obviously in How We Break, you found it, and you mentioned they're now challenging, obviously, I think for a number of different reasons. So,
Yeah,
so how did you navigate it through to get to the end product? Which because it's a brilliant read, and those of you who yet to read it, what it does is Vincent illustrates or mentioned earlier, it does bring together like psychology, sociology, popular culture, the Bible. I mean, there's so many different references, and then the other bit, which I think more so than the first book, is that because obviously the first book you talk about incidental things in your life, but what I suppose really resonated with me in this one was that narrative of you, and like, so your mother obviously as a narrative device throughout it,
yeah,
I think is really powerful, and obviously talking about your family more broadly. But I just find that really, because so the whole, that's a common thread I thought went through it, and then other people come off that, either
yeah.
people you obviously the case studies that I know they're amalgam case studies and so on, but I just thought that really for me really helped this time. So in a way that must have been maybe easy or difficult. I don't know what was more easy and more difficult to do it that way. But yeah, so tell us how you got to the end then.
Couple of things there. The case studies, which is kind of how I think about them. Me and my mum and a very close friend who we've called Sammy in the book. The first iteration of the book, which was about twice the length of that one, it was much more memoir, and
Mm-hmm.
it was almost too confessional. And I thought there's stuff here that the reader doesn't really need to know.
Mm-hmm.
How do I make this useful? So the second iteration was much more, I want these to be useful illustrative case studies.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was almost taking a slight step back from both myself and my mum and going, how does, and this sounds very clinical, but how does my mum help illustrate the concept of depression and regret?
Mm-hmm.
How
Yeah.
do I help illustrate the concept of social anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and how, for instance, mindfulness could be a useful intervention for that?
Mm-hmm.
So it was a much more, and I guess this is just inevitable. The first write was fairly kind of, emotionally hot, for want of a better way of putting it. The second edit was much more clinical. How does this work as a piece? Which is probably why it took quite a long time. But I think it works in the end, and I think they're useful stories. And I think particularly a lot of people are resonating with Sammy and Anne, who we see in both cases. Sammy's an agency care worker. Anne is also in some kind of caring profession, but we see them really struggle. And we introduce the notion of allostatic load through and with them, which I think that people have really resonated with their stories, because we kind of see how work kind of affects employment and employment structures and social
Do you want maybe tell us a bit about the allostatic load stuff for those of you who are not familiar with allostatic load, and tell us a bit about that. That'd be great.
Yeah, homeostasis is the work that we do to stay the same. It's the work that we're doing now to kind of maintain our body temperature, maintain our posture. We're spending a lot of our metabolism on homeostasis. Allostasis is the work that you have to do to maintain stability in the face of change and challenge. So when you have to go up a gear or two, whether it's a good challenge or a challenging, difficult challenge, when you're having to maintain that stability while you know that you're kind of, functioning a bit in the red, that's allostasis. And allostatic load and overload, it's when you begin to feel not just the mental, but the emotional and the physiological wear and tear of that, in terms of, inflammation, dysregulation of the immune system, cardiovascular dysregulation. And part of what we see in the book is both Sammy during the pandemic as an agency care worker and during austerity as a really conscientious person in the public sector, increasingly being asked to do more with less as life events then happen to her. We see both these people kind of go to the edge of themselves, and we see in Anne's case her tip over and become a clinical case in the fatigue clinic. Like you say, she's a fictionalized amalgam, but part of what I really love the notion of allostatic load. I think it's really useful, and I think it's one of those health psychology concepts that needs wider distribution, because psychologists are often very focused on big T trauma. Whereas this is a subtler way of showing that kind of the accumulation of the kind of daily blows of living can.
Well, we talk about it, it's just the daily hassles. It's accumulation.
Absolutely.
Daily hassles, and there's no off then, because you talk about the on-off system obviously as well.
Absolutely, and that kind of relates. So those were the case studies. Let's make these case studies, be they fictionalized, be they me, be they my mum. Let's make them illustrate these different forms that are kind of trembling and breaking can take, and that relates to the second point of the timeline of the book. There's a chapter in it called The Ambient Hum of Menace, where I was trying to illustrate, it's not just personal circumstances, it's being embedded in difficult work cultures where you're, say, constantly being audited. Again, you must know this in academia, there's a real pressure to do more with less, and you're only as good as your last performance review. And some people thrive on that, but some people do not. And so it's showing those kind of pressures, societal pressures. Sammy, the semi-fictionalized care worker we've been talking about, he's South Indian in a very potentially quite difficult part of Newcastle where he encounters a fair bit of racism, and that contributes to his allostatic load in a way that I don't experience living in the same area. So just looking at those different factors that can affect us as effectively as any personal stuff. And so I was writing that chapter, and then each time I thought, okay, that's probably as bad as stuff can get. And then it was like, then there was the pandemic, and then there was Trump got into power, and then there was war, and then there was another war. And it was like every time I thought I'd finished that chapter, something else happened. So ridiculous as it sounds, but that chapter is 27,000 words long by the end of.
Didn't read as long as that.
It's now down to, I think, just 8. And that was probably where I got stuck for the longest, is how do I communicate? How do I communicate the way the world can affect us? Because I think as health psychologists, we know that some of the major determinants of our mental and physical health are socioeconomic.
Oh yeah, totally,
and so in the book there's a real kind of clear steer away from these idiocentric models that say it's all about your thinking and your behaviors. No, we need to look at the context in which we're embedded. So that was probably the most difficult bit to get across. And I managed to square that eventually by, this may sound slightly weird and technical, but I was talking to Paul Atenello, who's a academic and Jungian psychotherapist in Newcastle. And he was saying, you're essentially doing what we would call a paranoid reading of this. You're saying these systems are all out to get us. And the thing about paranoia is it's proliferative. The more that you go into it, the more it expands. And he said, what you really want to do is just look at it from the viewpoint of the effect rather than the cause. And that's when I thought, oh, this is how I condense it. Let's not get too much into these awful games we can get caught up in. Let's just look at how they affect us individually. So, and that solved that chapter. And then the rest of that became a lot easier.
Yeah, no, because that is a really powerful chapter. I think it's in that chapter as well, because you've got the book's divided really in two parts, isn't it? Trembling and then breaking. And the arrhythmia is that in that chapter? I can't remember if it's that chapter or not, but obviously the illustration obviously of the power of these traumas, and big or small traumas, how irrespective of how they come about. And I suppose what's nice is because you do have that balance of, because you don't dismiss the fact that obviously we all come with our own genetics and vulnerability factors, but of course our environment is obviously so powerful, and it's that interplay, that embeddedness or the embodied stress, I suppose, a manifestation. The bit I was really struck by when I was looking at my notes here is there's a lot of discussion about willpower. I think again this comes back to your mother, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because it's something I've been reflecting on, because, well, you can maybe if you tell us what you meant by the willpower story, and then I'll give you my reflections.
Again, as health psychologists, one of the things that we're going to be talking to our students about, and we just had our new MSc Health Psychology cohort start yesterday from the recording of the podcast, and it's lovely to kind of have a new group and be working with them and to introduce them to what's unique about health psychology. And one of the things that health psychology addresses, which is an issue that's as old as the hills, like you see it in St. Paul, you see it in Buddhism, is that we all know what we should do, but the problem is actually how do we make ourselves do it? And that intention behavior gap, as we've kind of labeled it, it goes back to the core of what ethics means. We know how to live, but how do we implement that, and what are some of the blocks to that? And it was one of the things my mother lionized, were people who could make themselves do incredibly difficult things no matter what the circumstances. So the kind of the head of her pantheon was Lawrence of Arabia, particularly the Peter O'Toole cinematic version, who, when he was told you can't cross I think it's the Sinai Desert, said it's simply a matter of going. And this was someone who, whatever the circumstances, would do it. And because she was so disabled, is probably the most accurate word, by her own worry and regret and dysphoria and depression, she actually found it very difficult to push further than she had. I mean, if we look at what she did, given her beginnings and where we all ended up, I mean, it's an astonishing trajectory. Like having two professors for kids coming from this poor working class background, that's down to, or the effort there is down to my mum, but she never quite escaped her own traps. Whereas my oldest brother Ian, he's annoyingly conscientious. I mean, he really embodies willpower, and he's at the age of 70, he's just become, I think, one of the top runners in his bracket.
I'm not at all surprised knowing Ian.
It's insane. So I've grown up thinking and experiencing this notion of willpower, and my mum would always say to me, "That's your problem. You don't have enough willpower." But no matter what we did, we never had enough willpower.
But in her mind, I wonder, because what I was thinking was, right, so is it true, right, in the sense that, so how willpower similar, different to conscientiousness? What's it? How does it interplay with negative affect? How does it interplay neuroticism? Obviously, you talk about a lot about your neuroticism or
absolutely, I think it plays into all of them, and I think one of the challenges of putting the book together was to go in a way that makes sense and is entertaining. These things are complex and they're multifactorial, and if you look at the notion of willpower. I mean, we know this, for instance, from nudge interventions. You can
Yeah.
set up environments where certain good behaviors become easier, they require less effort. But I think if you just think of it purely in terms of individual kind of muscular effort, there's certainly an element of that, and it probably correlates with conscientiousness and probably correlates slightly negatively with neuroticism. And we know that those two correlate negatively anyway, neuroticism and conscientiousness. So there's definitely a kind of, there's a given amount of it, but there's also social, interpersonal, political circumstances that will make it easier for some people to act and to do stuff than others. So, I've kind of learned to supplement my so-called lack of willpower, thanks mum, with scaffolding that will enable me to do stuff.
Well, see, what the next question for me was when I was reading that was, so in the book there's a lot of coverage on exhaustion, about fatigue, right?
Yeah.
So and obviously your mother is obviously sadly no longer with us, but I just wonder would she think fatigue, exhaustion are the lack of willpower?
No, I don't think so, because latterly in her life she encountered that herself, where she just got worn out. And
The allostatic load stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And she I've put it in the book, she does this really resonant rewrite of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's famous, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." And my mum's take was, "What doesn't kill me makes me scunnered." And scunnered is this great Scottish word that just means totally hacked off to the point of just, screw it.
That's a great rewriting of Nietzsche.
Isn't it? Because I think it's also true. I think this whole notion that adversity kind of, brings out the best in us, I think it's nonsense. So, no, I think we can all get worn out. And again, that's what I saw in the fatigue clinic, and also saw in myself. Until you hit your own wall, you don't really know what your limits are. And I was seeing a lot of people who all their life had been used to thinking of themselves as conscientious, stoic, hardworking, copers. But it just took 2 or 3 life events, or just too much going on for too long for them, like you say, for that fund of energy just to be exhausted. So there's definitely a relation between the two.
So then the question then is, if you bring it to the research, then, well, 2 questions, I suppose, Vincent. One is, so what would you in the clinic, what would you recommend for what's the evidence tell us about what works for fatigue? Yeah. And then the second one is, I know you have just published a Lancet paper, I think, that on an RCT and across multiple sites in England. So do you want to tell us about both of those?
Yeah. I think the kind of the meta answer to both of them is it tends to be highly individualized, and I think that is quite a difficult story to tell scientifically. I think part of what makes good CBT or any good psychotherapy good is when it's based on an individualized formulation. And we've worked on that randomized control trial where we were training GPs in a brief intervention to help them deal with people with persistent physical symptoms like chronic pain, chronic fatigue, IBS, headaches, the kind of commoner garden stuff that isn't accountable for in terms of pathophysiology, but that GPs are seeing all the time. So how can we improve the treatment of that? And again, the answer to that, or the multiple answers to that, was it was always highly individualized. It was when we did our fear of falling intervention development, when we've worked with people with head and neck cancer, there was never one size intervention that fitted all. So I think that's part of the answer. And I realize I've now gone down a track, and you need to remind me what the question is. So it was about.
Well, let's try. Well, just I suppose a twofold. One is what in the fatigue clinic you've been working for years.
Yeah.
So, what I mean, so obviously you mentioned in the book, obviously CBT, as well as acceptance and commitment therapy and other things, mindfulness and whatever appear. And just one is the evidence cells works, and then obviously you've told us about that trial, and that trial I didn't quite realize it was such a heterogeneous group of patients, but obviously was effective at symptom clinic intervention.
Yeah, well, let's start with that, because in a way it illustrates both points. Is that the intervention where we train GPs to help people with persistent physical symptoms, it was called the REAL intervention, REAL, and the R stood for recognition, recognizing that what the patient's saying is true. So a lot of the battle that we were seeing in the clinic, that I've seen multiple times in people with disputed or disbelieved conditions is that they have to work even harder than people with, say, diabetes or cancer to get recognition and believed. So a lot of the patients in the clinic would say to us, one of the main things you did was believe us, which sounds so simple, but it often doesn't happen. The E was for explain. How can we come up with a version of what's going on with you in terms of your chronic pain or your headache? You've had all these tests, are negative. How can we explain what's happening to you? And so we were using some of the more recent research around stuff like interoceptive processes to explain how the communication between the brain and the body are continually signaling these distressing symptoms, and that's an automatic process that it's really difficult to interrupt. It's not something that you're doing intentionally. We did some pre-work on studies leading up to that, looking at the kind of ways you do that. So for instance, in non-cardiac chest pain, so a lot of people who have had heart attacks will present later on with chest pain in cardiac clinics, even though there's nothing happening. It's kind of, they're now fine. And you can say there's two versions of explaining that, or forming a form of explanation. You could say, because of what's happened to you, you're really focusing in that area of your body. You're really tuning in. So anything that happens is you're amplifying it and you're worrying about it. So that's one kind of register of explanation. There's another that is, because of what's happened to your body, your brain is now encoding this as an area of danger. So your brain is automatically tuning into that and amplifying any signal that's coming from there and raising the alarm. And I think it's kind of fairly clear what patients prefer. That the second one is much less blaming and it's much more kind of physiologically based. So those were the kind of explanations we were coming up with. So recognize the symptom is real, come up with an explanation, and then given that, what can you do about it? What's the action? That's the A. So for some people, it might be, okay, the chronic pain isn't necessarily a sign that I need to stop activity. I might do a 5-minute walk 2 times a day. Or for someone who's working really hard, maybe I'll take a break. One of the GPs I was working with, Johnny Coates, said that what he really loved is that in that clinic he was prescribing joy, because often what had disappeared from people's lives was joy. So he was doing a kind of behavioral activation, joy intervention, and then do that and then learn. That's the L. And each do that over 3 or 4 sessions, and that was the intervention. First session 50 minutes, next 3 were 20 minutes, and it seemed to make a significant difference to patients' physical symptoms and well-being. So that in a nutshell is kind of the answer. That wasn't a nutshell, that was a very long answer. Is what every single case I've seen is. It's always based on an individualized narrative. The interventions will be different for each person. They'll try it out, they'll see what works, they'll see what doesn't, and repeat. It's that kind of iteration that I think really helps people.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And if anyone wants to know more, full details of the papers in Lancet, I think it came out in June of this year.
That's right, yeah.
And available, I dare say, available also from your website, Vincent. Okay, so let's try and sort of bring it all together towards the sort of bring it to an end. A couple of things I suppose I'm curious about is, if you had all the money in the world, Vincent, right? And so either in research area you're interested in now, either the fatigue stuff or some other area which is pertinent to when we break, what would you spend it on? And what do you think is a key priority for us?
I didn't know how you would do this, Rory, but it's something that's crossed my mind, certainly in writing the book and certainly in the clinic, is so the person in front of you or yourself, you see that when we're pushed to the edge, there may be a genetic element. So there may be a tendency to neuroticism, like in myself. Then there's an element of upbringing and how that might prime you to deal with different circumstances. Then there's the sheer luck. There's the kind of circumstances that you meet. Then there's your cognitions and your behaviors. There's your physiology. There's the allostatic load and the way that affects your different systems. And it's like, how do you actually prove that as a model? because it's intuitively correct that, you know, that there's going to be a mixture from the genetic up to the social and the political, and like we were saying earlier, the socio-economic. We know that one will affect the other, but how do we actually model and prove that? Can science ever get to the point where it can actually take an individual and go, okay, it's 50% this, it's 20% that, it's 1%.
Yeah.
I think that may be an impossible answer, and I think maybe that takes us back to the art of good therapy and good intervention, is you're making a narrative that in some way tries to model that. But can you ever prove that as a narrative? Thoughts?
I mean, that's a big question. I don't know if we can, but we can certainly make strides trying to. I
Yeah.
don't know if we'd ever get there though.
Yeah, and I think you can prove some of the elements of that.
Yeah.
You know, you can prove sort of, say, interaction between, I don't know, stress and immune function. You can do some of it, but putting the whole picture together, I don't know. I'm intrigued by that. But there does seem to be a move, and I don't know if it's more a kind of lip service towards personalized medicine, towards actually acknowledging that each case will present differently.
Yeah, and we haven't, even though we talk that language, personalized medicine, personalized interventions, we really haven't. I mean, we've made a few strides forward, but my God, we've such a journey to go. It's such a distance to go.
That's my impression too.
It's testing personalized approaches, I think, is also challenging.
Yes, yeah, and I wonder if that needs new methodologies. But so that's where I'd put a bunch of money.
That sounds good. Okay, before we just bring it to a close with we try and end with two unrelated questions, but just going back to the trilogy, just as we make this nice whole, is we've had book 1, we've had book 2. When will we expect book 3, which is How We Mend?
I really hope you wouldn't ask me that in public. I'm gonna try. My editor.
But you can give us a broad.
I expect to get a decent first draft to my editor in the next year, and then the publishing process usually takes at least a year after that. So we're probably talking 2 or 3 years realistically.
Okay. I must say, really looking forward to reading How We Mend. Okay, so Vincent, 2 last quick ones, unrelated, just before we finish. One is, there's a lot of reflection in this book. A question we often ask our guests is, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
I'd kind of want to be there, because the 16-year-old self that then transitioned from home to university had a really, really hard time, because I did not know how to do socialization. I did not know how to do people. I was a very introvert, very inwards child. And so when I was thrown into first year at university, I didn't have a clue how to do people. I would put myself through some intensive socialization program, but a really kind one. Because I really needed social skills that I had to learn the hard way. So I would do some kind of mentoring for myself. Okay,
mentoring for yourself. I like that. I don't think we've had that one before. And then the second question, last question is, if you could have dinner or coffee with anybody, living or dead, famous or not famous, who would it be and why?
Just one person or more than one?
Okay, you can go for more than one if you want.
Because I've been listening to Conan O'Brien podcasts as part of getting into the book 3 mode. I've actually been tuning into a lot more comedy, and just thinking about laughter and humor and peace and joy. Whereas I've spent 10 years thinking about breaking and suffering. I don't want to do that anymore. And Tiffany Haddish, the American comedian, she was just a hoot. She's been on his podcast twice. I'd really like to have her and Marcel Proust together, because I think they would have a real hoot together, because he was a brilliant observer of social mores, as is she, and she's also just talks completely uninhibitedly about her sex life in a way that is just hilarious. I think those two together would be
that's a great combination. I might seek out both of them in the podcast world, and that sounds really good. Okay, Vincent, on behalf of Craig and I and MQ, thanks a million. Really looking forward to book 3, and as I say, to those who haven't read it, please, I urge you, go and read How We Break. It's a really fascinating read, stimulating and thought-provoking. And the last thing I'll say I like how I think at the end of the chapters you get us to reflect, and that's always really good. So huge thanks, and thanks for the work obviously you've been done over many years as a health psychologist. Thanks a million, Vincent.
Rory and Craig, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.